Hi, everybody. So, thanks for the introduction, Kat, and thank you all for your kind invitation to join you here. My first visit to Columbia. I had the privilege of a Dave Cowan tour on Saturday, so I got 3 hours of all the highlights in the state capitol and the campus, and I even got some hot boiled peanuts. So I'm feeling right at home about now. So I had lots of friends at USC, the other USC, as we say out in California. But this is my first opportunity to get to know the geospatial professional community of South Carolina, and I'm really delighted to have that opportunity with you today. So, as Kat said, I lead the education outreach team at Esri. Susan Lambert gave an excellent background on Esri. I think you all probably know the company pretty well, so I'll spare you the company profile today. I will say, however, though, that Susan, we like the name SCARC just fine. South Carolina Art Users Group, we like that name just fine. So thanks for holding on to that for 25 years. As Kat also mentioned, my background is higher education. I had a 22-year career at Penn State, a wonderful career there. And my research and service work, again, as Kat outlined, was more and more focused as I went on issues related to the professionalization of your field. And there's a clear reason for me why I got involved in those efforts, and that is that when students came to Penn State, just as they come to USC, when they come and invest years of time and thousands of dollars of tuition in getting a degree from your program, implicit in that is our assurance that that money and time will be well spent. Right? So implicitly, we're making a claim that if you do a degree in geography with a specialization in GIS or whatever degree you happen to do, and enter into this field, that you're going to enter into a profession that's desirable, that's important, that in fact does make a difference in the world. And so my feeling was that the professionalization of our field was an important part of that compact with students. That's how I got involved in issues like this. So my purpose today is to consider this question. Why is it, in a thriving industry like ours, do employers have trouble finding qualified recent graduates, when at the same time, so many recent graduates report that it's so hard to find a job? That's a paradox, isn't it? So first, what we're going to do in this talk is, first we're going to investigate the claim that the geospatial industry is indeed thriving. It's a well-known claim. Where's the evidence? And then I want to look second into the difficulties that employers face in trying to hire qualified recent graduates. Finally, we're going to consider what the industry, your industry, can do to help resolve this paradox. And I'm going to talk in particular about what Esri is trying to do to help. Okay? So with that, let's dive into the geospatial industry. So the evidence is that the field is indeed thriving. Some of you may be familiar with an economic impact study performed by a group called Oxera. Anybody heard of this? Commissioned by Google. Last year, Dave Cowan was about this, of course. It's a pretty interesting and important document. It reveals in part kind of Google's view of the world, of what geoservices is all about. But I think it's also a very telling perspective on where our field is going. And that, I think, will be a point for conversation not only after this talk, perhaps, but perhaps even later tomorrow when we do the crystal ball session. So, for Google, geoservices comprises, look at what they consider the field about. Satellite receivers and manufacturing, electronic maps, satellite navigation, satellite imagery, and location-based search. It's a remarkably consumer and business-oriented conception of our field. They point out from this economic impact study, this group Oxera was able to demonstrate that geoservices accounts for $150 to $270 billion in revenue worldwide. And they compare that, usefully I think, to the video games industry, $25 billion a year. Who would have thought that our industry is substantially larger than the video gaming industry? I wouldn't guess that. And they even compare it to the airline industry at $594 billion bigger, but not an order of magnitude bigger. Wow, this should be fairly exciting, right? If true, if we could believe it. So, in addition to that 150 to 270 billion in revenue, Auxera claims that geoservices adds value at a rate of around $100 billion a year. And what's the nature of this value? Well, in general, Auxera, Google, characterizes value by efficiencies gained and money saved. Like, for example, billions of hours of commuting time through more efficient routing, billions of liters of petrol saved by more efficient routing and related geoservices. Not only efficiencies gained, but in some cases, those gained efficiencies lead to lives saved. By their count, in Great Britain alone, in 2012, 152 lives were saved due to more efficient emergency services related to routing in particular. And they can point to all kinds of specialized areas like in precision agriculture, the savings of billions and billions of dollars through more efficient irrigation, a topic that's of great importance to my drought-stricken new home state of California. And perhaps of interest to some of the students here, they were also able to document that students higher education students, graduates, whose education involved geoservices made higher salaries, marginally, 3%, higher salaries 5 years after graduation than people who don't. Wow, right? Is this exciting or not? I think so. And let's see, there, sorry. I want to bring your attention now to a second economic impact study, and this one relates to the United States in particular. It's done by a group called Boston Consulting Group. This is new stuff, relatively, December 2012, again, commissioned by Google. And they characterize the nature of our field as serving the following markets. Business applications like sales and marketing, logistics, strategic decision-making, including precision agriculture, and consumer-oriented applications like maps and navigation, local business search. Again, a very consumer-oriented, business-oriented conception of our field. And in due fairness, they point out that the applications that we all probably think of, associate with our field, like government services, basic services administration, resource management, and defense, they say that that's out of scope for their study. So in Google's world, the things that most of us would consider the core applications of geospatial are out of scope. So what's going on here? What's going on is that we're beginning to see a distinction that I'll explore later in this talk between the core geospatial activities associated with folks like you and the new innovative frontier of applications that are mainly business-oriented and consumer-oriented. And this poses, I think, a challenge to our identity as a field, and it's of particularly importance when we're trying to align students' prospects for getting good careers and employers' need, especially at the innovative frontier. So this table points out the different sectors, geo-expert industries like GIS software companies, application and devices, and location-based geodata, the folks who look data. They claim that altogether in the US, that accounts for almost $73 billion in revenue in 2012, and about 500,000 workers. Even though this conception is different than the traditional conception of geospatial, that number of workers is about that jives pretty well, as we'll see, with what the U.S. Department of Labor estimates for our field. They characterize the growth of the field, and they claim that we're in the midst of a high growth period that's consistent with what Oxera points out. And we're moving toward a fully integrated stage. It's a timeline, but they don't have years or dates added to it. But it's worthwhile reading one sentence out of this. They envision a time, a fully integrated phase in which geospatial services are seamlessly integrated into core business processes of both large and moderate-sized firms. I believe that's the future that many of you have been envisioning for some time. And according to the folks that do the economic analysis, that's exactly where we're headed. Heady stuff. And some of you may know it was in Art News. Just recently, this was 2010, the first formal return on investment study performed by an economist at the University of Washington for King County, Washington, where Seattle is, demonstrated a net benefit of $180 million in value gained by government operations and benefits to citizens, compared to an investment that year of $14.6 million. In other words, however you conceive of this field, whether you conceive of it in the traditional sense or in terms of this innovative frontier that Google envisions, there's compelling evidence at all levels that the field is indeed thriving. So now let's consider the workers who enable all this economic activity. Let's talk about employment. This is this chart is a compilation of the 2010 and 2020 estimates by the Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you do a search on the Department of Labor's ONET website and you search on geospatial, you get 9 out of these 10 professions. You have to do a different search to catch geodetic surveyors. But essentially, these are the occupations recognized by the Department of Labor. And the ones with the asterisks are really quite brand new. It was just December of 2009 that the first occupations with the word GIS, with the acronym GIS in them, were established. 2009, that's how young our, some make the argument that it's a 50-year-old field. In fact, the Department of Labor is just formalizing us now. Some exciting estimates in terms of the number of workers in each of these occupations. A total, for 2010, a total estimate of 424,000 people. Again, that's rough, same order of magnitude as that Google estimate, even though we have a Venn diagram is partially overlapping sets. But the most exciting thing for educators, and especially for students, is the Department of Labor's estimate that close to 150,000 additional jobs in geospatial are going to be created by 2020. And of that 150,000, about a third are GIS jobs. Pretty exciting stuff. And for educators who are making that implicit assurance of a worthwhile career, this is a big relief, right? Because for a long time, this was an act of faith based on our experience locally with our view of the community. And only now in the last couple of years, have we actually had evidence where we can be assured that that claim to students of a worthwhile future is a fair and legitimate claim. That's a big deal. Of course, there's a geography. This is a bit of an aside. There is a geography to employment in our field. The opportunities are not the same everywhere, of course. This is from, let me get the date right, this is from February 2012, and GIS Lounge mapped 3,000 GIS job ads. And it points out that if you know anything about if you imagine the population surface of the United States, you realize that population distribution doesn't account for all this variation. If it did, there wouldn't be such a big spike in Houston in 2010, right? And probably by now, if we did this now, there'd probably be spikes up in North Dakota and South Dakota related to the energy industry. So this is part of the deal of matching recent graduates with jobs is that the jobs aren't everywhere, right? They're in places where people are, and they're in places where valuable resources are being extracted or processed, and where population is growing. That's a hyper generalization. It'd be wonderful to see a graduate student do a thesis on the geography of GIS employment. So let's consider now who puts these people to work. Well, from Esri's perspective, the surrogate measure that we have is that our company and our business partners support about at least 1 million people whose livelihoods depend on our technology and the applications you all built around, on top of that technology. Those workers work in over 300,000 organizations worldwide, and in a whole bunch of different industries, some of which I'm profiling here, about 30 industries. And the anecdotal evidence from customers like you all confirms the fact that many employers feel that there's a shortage of qualified workers, and oftentimes we hear, I heard this as an educator too, that the graduates we're producing don't have what it takes to be successful in the workforce. Everybody wants to fix this. Why is it so hard? In fact, our own company, Esri, has a lot of trouble hiring people, has trouble finding people with the right skills and spirit, if you will. Now, at this point, I want to bring your attention to a third study. This one commissioned by the Chronicle of Higher Education and the American Public Media show Marketplace. Anybody listen to Kai Listall? Marketplace, yeah, it's a great show. They commissioned this thing, and they put a group called Experience to work to prepare a survey of employers that addresses exactly that question of trying to match up recent graduates with job needs. So these folks reached out to 50,000 employers. The study doesn't say, for some reason, whether that was worldwide or the US. I think it was just the US. And of those, a relatively small number, but a useful sample of 704 executives and human resources personnel responded to the survey. And more than half of all those respondents reported that they had difficulty finding qualified recent graduates. And the difficulty was most acute in science and technology employers. Now, none of this is specific to GIS, but certainly employers like you all would probably classify yourself in science and technology, and they're the ones that said that they had the most trouble finding recent qualified graduates. So then, where do employers find geospatial workers? We could have a nice discussion around this. It seems to me that there are three general sources of finding qualified employees. One, recent graduates from higher education. Second, current employees who are retrained, right? Many of you probably know, and some of you probably are, folks who specialized in CAD at one point, so were retrained to work as GIS workers. And of course, the third category then is experienced practitioners who are hired away from other employers, like poached, right? Quite a few Esri people fall into that category, one direction or the other. That recent graduates find it difficult to find a job is that new graduates account for a minority of total hires, right? Maybe you all knew this. This was news to me. According to this survey, nearly half of employers, less than 20% of their new hires were recent graduates. They were from those other categories of employment. And again, this is a particularly acute problem in scientific and technical fields. Okay, so then why are recent graduates less competitive? Well, the findings in this survey from employers was that it wasn't their scientific or technical skills that was most of the problem. The problem was, according to these respondents, first, was communication abilities. Second, the ability to manage multiple priorities. And third, decision-making and problem-solving skills. The kind of things that, frankly, most higher education programs don't teach in any explicit way. They're expected to be learned implicitly through, like, making a thesis while you're taking classes. But we're not doing a good enough job of it. And in the science and technology industries in particular, communication skills were rated on par in accordance with technical knowledge associated with the job. That's pretty remarkable and should have very important implications for education. Now, fortunately, the competencies required for success across the various geospatial definitions are really quite well defined now. Are they perfectly defined? No, but they're quite well defined compared with where we were 10 years ago. For example, this initiative of the U.S. Department of Labor to create a geospatial technology competency model did a pretty thorough and careful job of combining the perspectives of workforce analysts and practitioners and educators to define, at first, those core industry-wide and industry sector-specific competencies required for success. But equally important and a distinctive characteristic of this specification compared to the body of knowledge is that there was equal emphasis put on these foundational competencies one develops in the workforce or in the workplace, academic competencies and personal affective competencies, things like interpersonal skills, initiative. The word gumption actually shows up in this standard, which I really love. Lifelong learning, business fundamentals. At Penn State, we did a review of our master's degree curriculum in alignment with this standard. And the one gaping hole we found on curriculum was we did nothing related to business fundamentals. And I would dare say very few programs do. And most of you out there who are working for a living know that those are really fundamentally important for success in the field. Okay then, so what can be done to make recent graduates more competitive? Well, there are two things. One way is to improve the educational experience and so that it's more responsive to industry needs. Everybody's been working on that for as long as I've been in the profession, and a lot longer for some of you. But there's a second way too, and that is to improve the pool of students who seek degrees related to geospatial technology by being not just higher quality, more accomplished students, but also more of them, right? A bigger pool. I want to address each of those possibilities in order then. Let's look at education first. So, how well can you see this map? This is an ArcGIS online map that I made that shows the status of ESB licenses at the top 400 universities in the world that's ranked by the Times of London. It's a pretty favorable distribution. Of those top 400 universities, 95% have some sort of licensed ESB software, and 70% have education site licenses. So that's quite a bit of penetration into the education market. In fact, the total number of education customers worldwide now is 10,000 education institutions. So the problem isn't that the software isn't available. Right? It's available in most of the leading universities and community colleges around the country and around the world. The fact is, despite that really quite widespread access, geospatial education has not remotely reached its potential. And I'd like to outline 4 reasons for that fact, for that shortcoming. First of all, is that while geospatial technology and GIS jobs are well known to some of us, well known in those core traditional mapping disciplines, awareness remains very, very low across the curriculum. Is that changing now? There's evidence that it is. But still, if we were to stop and take a measure of it now, awareness of what you do is not widespread in higher education, let alone in schools. Second is that the specialized programs that do address, that do prepare people for success in the field, with rare exceptions, focus on that traditional core activity, not on the innovative frontier of application development that's consumer and business oriented. So in other words, our education system is generalization here. We can have an argument about this. In general, our education institutions are focused on the past and not the future. Or let me say the present and not the future. Okay? That's a big issue. And I hope it's one that's discussed in the, I know you have plenty of questions already for your session tomorrow, but maybe that'll come up. Third, the fact is, and I know this from experience, educators have a devil of a time keeping up with technologies like ours that are changing, it seems like every day. It's extraordinarily hard, even for us working in companies, to keep up with what's going on. But for educators who have many, many responsibilities and precious little time to actually work with the technology, it's impossible to keep up. And that is reflected in many curricula. USC could be an exception to that. And I know Dave and Lynn are both hands-on guys. But I can assure you that in many places that's a serious problem. It's a difficulty in keeping up. And finally, higher education itself struggles to offer affordable education that prepares people for the real needs of the workforce. And you all know that with all the discussion about the future of higher education and changing public attitudes about the role of university and the appropriateness of public support. Those four things are not excuses. They explain, I hope, why GIS education has yet to really reach its potential. So what can we do about that? Well, the number one most important thing, and it comes up in the survey, and you know it from your experience, nothing is more important than internships. Because we saw before that experienced employees were preferred. Well, the good news is internships count. So how many out there work for organizations that offer internships? Well, that's pretty good. It ought to be 100%, right? Easier said than done. I know internships are hard. ESB offers a program. We had 90 interns last year out of 3,200 applicants. Obviously, the demand greatly exceeds the supply. And there's nothing more important industry can do to help make recent graduates more effective, or soon-to-be graduates better prepared than to offer internships. Another thing is to pay attention to standards. And in higher education, the geospatial technology competency model is worth looking at. Not just as a way to assess your curriculum, but I think the most exciting potential is for individual students to assess their strengths and weaknesses relative to this Department of Labor standard, and then go about, not just in their formal education, but in continuing professional development, create a roadmap for how you can address deficiencies that maybe put you at a disadvantage in the workforce. Another thing is to consider that the field is becoming something different than it was. That there's an expanding periphery, an expanding frontier is a better word, headed in this direction towards software and application development. These are the three sectors of employment as recognized by the Department of Labor for our field. And the fact is that a lot of the innovation and a lot of the employment growth is moving towards this expanding innovative frontier that's, as Google points out, is consumer-oriented and business-oriented. And our education programs, by and large, don't address this trend adequately. That's something that my team has responsibility for, and something that we work on a lot, is to work with educators and talk about. Well, how do we support this trend, and what's the proper role of the university in that? Advisory boards are extremely important. Having a group of industry folks who meet once a year with the core faculty of academic programs related to geospatial, and to make sure that curricula, advising, internship opportunities are actually rooted in evolving industry needs is a very, very positive thing. I know we had a fabulous experience with that at Penn State, and I know that works well in other places. But a surprising number don't actually have industry advisory boards who are actively involved in evolving the curriculum. And so, yeah, Esri is trying to help. We do a number of things like our education site license program, publications through Esri Press. We have an education GIS conference that attracts nearly 1,000 educators. happens the weekend before the user conference. And I know I'll see some of you there. And we have an Esri Development Center program, which provides special status and special access to technology and support for those few departments that are actually trying to do something about that innovative frontier, who are actually trying to challenge their students to use ArcGIS as a platform that is a foundation upon which custom applications are developed. So then, final question, or final point, final thread. How can we make the geospatial professions more appealing, raise awareness, so that we can attract an improved and larger pool of applicants to these programs? And I want to point to a number of interesting trends. You know, it was 2003 that the Department of Labor first began to hype geospatial, what they call the geospatial industry, as one of the 3 top high-growth technology fields. Remember, it was compared to biotechnology and nanotechnology. Well, at that point, we educators were breathing in a bag. We were so excited about the potential growth of our field. But it really, to some extent, it seemed like hype because there wasn't a lot of this economic impact stuff to go with it, to support it. Well, since then, a lot has happened. The Geospatial Revolution programs, have some of you seen the Geospatial Revolution videos? Oh yeah, well, you definitely, if anybody here needs to explain what we do as a field to the bomb, show even just the trailer of this series, the 4-minute trailer, which is publicly and freely available, geospatialrevolution.psu.edu. It does as good a job as anything of popularizing and really kind of dramatizing the importance of what we do collectively. And efforts like this to raise awareness are important. This is getting 500,000 views. And they're launching now a second edition of this. There's going to be a second expanded edition of Geospatial Revolution that we hope will ultimately become a public television program. Some of you may have heard of massive open online courses. Have you? A huge trend in education, the idea of offering this started when a couple of professors at Stanford offered a course on artificial intelligence, and they opened up and said, anybody can take it. And 170,000 students showed up from all around the world. Right, 2 guys, they didn't even have teaching assistants. And they spun that off into a company called Coursera, which is one of the leading MOOC platforms, if you will. Coursera, in that short period of time, 2012, 2013, now has 5 million students. The first course on maps and GIS was offered last summer. It attracted 47,000 students from around, mostly international. And remarkably, of that 47,000, nearly 25,000 successfully completed all the requirements of the course and earned a certificate. That's an extraordinarily high completion rate for MOOCs, and it's evidence, I think, of the excitement, the latent excitement that's out there around our field that we can take advantage of. One of the most important exciting trends that I get to work on is the fact that what we have seen in the past is textbooks, K-12 and higher education. The notion of a textbook is changing profoundly as we speak. The Chronicle of Higher Education talked about it as the object formerly known as the textbook. And both at the K-12 level and higher education level, textbook publishers are reimagining new business models around digital products because textbooks are too expensive and they go out of date and it isn't working, right? Especially in an era when we're concerned about costs. So what we're looking at and working with publishers and business partners is the idea that one conception of a textbook, something that might run on an iPad digitally, could be live linked to ArcGIS online maps and story maps that students could access. Imagine that a textbook doesn't just have a picture, but it has an interactive multi-scale thematic map coupled with assessment that would allow you to challenge students to solve spatial thinking problems. This has transformative potential in the field. And how many students look at textbooks every year? Hundreds of thousands of them. So we're right on the verge of a really huge impact and a new presence. How many of you knew that an interactive map quiz was the most frequently viewed article in the New York Times for all of 2015. It's right on the verge of something really, really important. And we even show up in the LA Times. Here's a Sunday LA Times paper talking about, basically about our field. And look, even Esri, which is generally not known as cool, shows up as described as geographic information systems may sound nerdy, but the results are anything but. This is, we're excited about this. And we're also excited, I'm right at the end now, I hope I'm on time. We're really excited about this new aspect, the kind of the core aspect of the ArcGIS platform, what we call ArcGIS Online. And what we're excited about it is not only its obvious advantages for working across devices without installation and its integration with many other aspects of the platform, but in particular, what the geographers among you and GIS analysts will be excited about is that analytical functions are now built into the ArcGIS Online platform. So we can, and we will begin this year, we will soon have a MOOC that is an introduction to spatial analysis. Next step up from mapping, right? Attracting tens of thousands of students. Right on the verge of a whole bunch of exciting stuff. So there's reason for optimism, even though it's frustrating that we have trouble aligning the needs of employers and recent graduates. It looks like we're about to break through here in terms of what it takes to have increased public awareness, which leads to a larger and better pool of students approaching the field. So, to summarize and to finish, the first question was, is the geospatial industry really thriving? Absolutely yes. The core is thriving, and the innovative frontier is thriving maybe even more so. But I think we have to think about the fact that the traditional conception of GIS is beginning to give way to one that is more business-oriented and consumer-oriented. This has implications for people trying to get hired, and it has implications for our curriculum. Why do employers and students have trouble finding each other? Well, because employers prefer experience. But the good news is that internships count as experience. So there is something that we collectively can do, and it has to be collectively, right? Education institutions can't do it themselves. We need partnerships with industry and government in order to provide more internships. It's hard, but it's possible. And of course, none of that says anything about what Thomas Friedman wrote about in the New York Times, where the title of the article was, "Want a job? Invent one." So much of the really exciting stuff happening for young people in the field is entrepreneurship. It's dreaming up new apps and starting new businesses. Esri itself was a little startup like that just 40 years ago. And finally, how can education industry make graduates more competitive? Well, improving the educational experience, particularly by an enhanced focus on those foundational competencies like communication, that really make people more competitive. But also, we can continue to expand the pool of incoming students by doing everything we can to increase awareness, broaden awareness about our field and about the wonderful things that you all do. Again, I'm so grateful for the invitation. I really enjoy being here with you, and I look forward to meeting many of you through the rest of the meeting. Thanks again.